Dear friends, welcome back from our lunch. It is now my very great pleasure to present our plenary speaker, Olle Granath. Olle is art historian, critic. He is former secretary of the Royal Swedish Academy of Fine Arts, also former director of the National Museum of Fine Arts and Museum of Modern Art. Important today, I think, is also that Olle Granath was the curator of a very big Strindberg exhibition in 2005 in Tate Modern Gallery. It was an exhibition about Strindberg as a painter and photographer, and it was a very successful exhibition in Tate Modern. I also want to say that in 2001, National Museum of Fine Arts had also a very big and good exhibition about Strindberg as a painter and photographer. Now, Olle, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation, and thank you for inviting me to these important Strindberg days. I'm going to talk about Strindberg mainly as a painter and sculptor, but I will also touch upon his interest in photography and the use he made of photography. When you read Strindberg, you always are struck by the way he visualizes what he writes about. There is a sensual presence in his prose that makes it very easy for your inner eye, visualize what you are reading about. And this, of course, has to do with his keen interest in images of all kinds. He was very careful when it came to the illustrations of his works. This interest for images goes during his whole life parallel with his writings. He was also, as you can see from this picture of a relatively young man, he was very well aware of the importance of posing in a good way in front of the camera. I just show these two photographs as an example of that. What we now know about his interest in painting is that he apparently had some student friends in Uppsala during the short term he was there studying, who were Sunday painters. And he writes about, at some place, how he tried to paint with his friends' utensils, with his brushes and his colors, but there is nothing left of what he then did. This painting from 1873 is one of the earliest works by his hands that we know about, and there are two similar paintings, the same motif but different color scale. And they are from Kymmendö, the island that was to become Hemsö in his novel about the fishermen and the population at Hemsö. This is also an early painting with a lighthouse near Sandhamn, probably. That is one of his earliest efforts. And this is the sea and the waves and the dramatical sky above the sea, which was to become one of his main motifs, repeated many, many times. Well, many, many times. We should know when we look at the paintings by Strindberg that all in all, there are about 110 paintings by his hand. That is all. There is a short passage in his novel, The Son of a Servant, where he recalls how he one day discovers the archipelago of Stockholm. He's out on a paramilitary exercise, and he's thrown into a bush where he's supposed to hold stand during the event. And then he suddenly looks up, and in front of his eye he sees the archipelago with a wide horizon and small and big islands that are showing up in front of his eyes. And this is an experience, although he was born in the middle of archipelago, which you are if you are born in Stockholm, he had never seen this landscape in such a way before, and it made a deep imprint on him. And a lot of his books, of course, deal with the archipelago and the life in the archipelago, but also his paintings are very much about the sea and the islands. And he also had, during his lifetime, a lot of addresses in the archipelago. He, wherever he was in the world, he had a tendency to return to the Stockholm archipelago for the summer. His painting really started in 1892, in the spring, after the divorce from Siri von Essen, his first wife. He says that he had difficulties in writing. He was so depressed by what has happened to him, and that the 3 children had gone away with their mother, and he was unable to use his pen the way he was used to. And then he had friends who helped him into working with the colors and the brushes. And there is a series of paintings from this early 1892, which this is one. And already here he shows some craftsmanship, some mastership in the color, the use of the color, the shift of the light from the deepest dark in the water up to the light on the tops of the waves, which is very poetical and very well done. So how could he suddenly show such a mastering of the brushes and the colors? Well, we know that his friends for many years had been mostly painters. He describes them in The Red Room in the novel, how he lives with painters, and some of his best friends are certainly painters, like the painter Selén in the book, who is painter Per Ekström from the island of Öland. And he lived for periods in their studios, and he certainly picked up a lot of knowledge of how to work with brushes and paints in this group of young bohemians in Stockholm. He also, in the 1870s, he worked as an art critic for Dagens Nyheter, the daily newspaper still existing in Stockholm. And he convinced Dagens Nyheter to send him to Paris in 1876 to write about the art there. And this is 2 years after the first Impressionist exhibition at Nadar's photo studio. And the Impressionists are still very much disputed in their home city. But Strindberg goes to galleries where he could see the Impressionist painters, and he wrote articles about them for Dagens Nyheter, where he shows a very good insight into their ideas and their goals, their aims, what they wanted to do with this new painting, colorful, very luminaristic, and less interested in the details that used to be favored by the academic paintings. Strangely enough, when he concludes his impressions of the Impressionists, he says he cannot agree with their goals. He sees it as a dead end in painting, though he, in the previous text, has shown a great understanding for what they were doing. This is a motif that will be repeated many times, and it has also been interpreted as a kind of symbolical self-portraits. It's a single herb or a single flower on the beach near the sea, and we see the heaven and the water that meet in a very clear horizon line, and there is this cosmic sense. The paintings are never big, but they give a sense, they have a scale in them that gives them a sense of cosmic view. And there is this lone flower standing on the beach, which could be interpreted as Strindberg himself facing the universe alone. This is another torch flower, the same kind of motif. I mean, it was, of course, so that when Strindberg had found a motif that he could master, then he repeated it. So the series of this kind of paintings is rather long. This is an exception. It's not an herb any longer. It's a toadstool, the lonely poisonous mushroom also on the beach. I have never seen a toadstool growing so near the water alone. So this is a pure poetical invention, but it's easy to think that he saw himself in the poisonous mushroom. This is a slightly enigmatic picture called the double picture, and Strindberg often makes comments on his own paintings, but on this one there seems to be nothing written by him. Although he has said in some other context that he's a weird character that oscillates between a kind of cheerfulness, happiness, and a very somber, dark character. And this painting is as if he wanted to give an image of his inner state of mind. He has cut out from one of these dark, dramatic paintings, he has cut out a part and inserted one of nice weather, one of these light summer paintings. So the two kind of meteorological phenomena meet in one painting, as he felt that different parts of his character met in himself. And we are still in this productive year, 1892. This is a sea mark near Sandhamn in the archipelago that was called the White Moor by the population. And it was surrounded by a lot of stories and spooky stories. You can imagine that it raised the fantasy of the people who saw this, especially in a dramatical weather like here. And here we can also see the traits of something that he, in some other paintings, was more clear about, and that is that there is a profile in the rock, and that profile in some paintings are very much like his own self-portrait. So here again, you have the lonely man who stands up against the rage of the elements and nature, also alone. This is one of these bad weather, stormy paintings with a rough sea that comes up again and again. And here my contrast, hard wind but nice weather, again with this very nicely treated color on the water. Strindberg has written somewhere that the first painting he can remember he made was after a reproduction in a magazine. It was a Scottish castle ruin. And that painting had disappeared for him. He couldn't find it again. So still this year, 92, when he took up painting seriously, he decided to, from his memory, paint this first painting of his once again. And this is this ruin that originally came from a magazine. Another of these seas, stormy seas, where he has not been content with the blackness of the black color. And what does he do? He takes out a burner and he burns the color so it becomes soot, there for example, and there, to make it even more dramatic. Steinberg, of course, had an advantage in front of his more trained colleagues in painting, that he could be completely unorthodox. There was nothing that was forbidden. He had not been educated in the academic way, so he could take liberties like this one, burning the color to soot, to enhance the dramatic effects of the painting. This is a painting he has made a comment on. It's called Golgotha, and you can see the crosses there, which could also be 3 masts on a ship in the storm. And on the left side in the painting, this is supposed to be a rock. And Strindberg says that on the rock we could see Buddha, or Wotan, standing in a black raincoat, which makes it more difficult to say whether he tells us the truth or not, because he may be there, but he may be not. And he also says that in the clouds above, there is Rembrandt looking over the painting. His face is in these clouds. I haven't really managed to identify Rembrandt in the clouds, but we must believe him. But we also see that he wants to adhere to history and to painters that he admired and he had respect for. There are 2 sculptures from his hand left, and the one is this weeping boy that has to do also with an essay that he wrote in the French language in 1894 and published in a magazine called La Revue des Revues. And I will read, and it's called on the role of chance in the creative act. And it is a very interesting essay because Strindberg offers, with a certain generosity and insight into his own procedure, the way he works. And I would read for you how this sculpture of a young weeping boy came about. I quote, "I once had the notion to make a clay model of a supplicant patterned on a model from antiquity. There he stood, arms raised, but I became dissatisfied with him, and in a fit of a pique I brought my hand down on the poor wretch's head. And lo, a metamorphosis that Ovid could not have envisioned. His Greek locks were flattened by the blow, made into a kind of Scottish tam o' shanter. Covering his face, his head and neck were pushed down between his shoulders. His arms fell until his hands were level with eyes under the beret. His legs gave way, his knees were brought together, and the whole thing was transformed into a weeping 9-year-old boy, hiding his tears behind his hands. Just a few additional touches, and the statue was perfect. That is to say, the viewer was given the intended impression. Afterwards, in the studio of my friends, I improvised a theory on automatic art. So here he dwells in a domain that had been quite well known among artists for many hundred years. We know that Strindberg did read Pliny the Elder, who can tell stories about the role of chance in the arts from long before the year 0. And there is reason to think that he also had read the notes of Leonardo da Vinci on painting, who also elaborates the idea of chance, of the possibility to read into what you see, things that were not intended from the beginning. A lot has been said about how much in advance Strindberg was when he wrote this, and that he was a precursor to what was going to happen in the visual arts a few decades later in the early modernism. This is something that could be disputed. I mean, La Revue des Revues was not La Revue Blanche, edited by Félix Fénillon. It was a quite obscure review, and not many people read it. And there was no need for artists in the coming decades to find inspiration from Strindberg, because they all read Pliny, and they all knew Leonardo da Vinci. What is remarkable with Strindberg's essay is, as I said, the insight he gives us into his own methods. And it starts with his wish to find music to a Orientalist play, Samum, that he had written. And he had been presented different pieces of music, of authentic Oriental music, and he was not satisfied with one of them. So he was, among many other things, he was a guitar player, and he had several guitars. And he took a guitar and he tuned the strings in a completely crazy manner. There was not one string that was tuned according to the rules. And then he started to take out a composition on the guitar. And what happens? He gets the perfect Orientalist music for his play. And then he continued with the story of this young boy that also might have touched him, because it reminded him of his own Hans that was taken away from him. This is another of his major paintings called the Wunderland, that he also describes in his essay. And let me quote him again when he describes it. I paint in my spare time. To master my material, I select a medium-sized canvas, or preferably a board, so that I am able to complete the picture in 2 or 3 hours while my inspiration lasts. I am possessed by a vague desire. I imagine a shaded forest interior from which you see the sea at the sunset. So, with the palette knife that I use for this purpose, I don't own any brushes. I distribute the paints across the panel, mixing them there so as to achieve a rough sketch. The opening in the middle of the canvas represents the horizon of the sea. Now, the forest interior unfolds, the branches, the tree crowns in groups of colors, 14, 15, helter-skelter, but always in harmony. The canvas is covered. I step back and take a look. Well, I'll be damned. There is no sea to be seen. The illuminated opening shows an endless perspective of rose-colored bluish light in which airy, disembodied, and undefined beings float like fairies, trailing clouds behind them. The forest has turned into a dark subterranean cave, obstructed by brambles, and in the foreground, let's see what it could be. Rocks covered with lichens, the likes of which are not to be found, and there on the right, the knife has glossed over the paint too much, so that it resembles reflections in water. Well, look, it's a pond. Wonderful. So he, in his observation of his own method, there he certainly is very modern, because this description of how it is to complete a painting could almost have been done by Jackson Pollock more than half a century later. This dialogue between the artist and his material and the surface he's working on. He also has his statement that, so, with the palette knife that I use for the purpose, I don't own any brushes. Well, this is a truth with many that one can ponder about, because Strindberg certainly owned brushes, and he could write such a thing in the essay, and the next day he could write a letter home to Sweden to his friend Richard Berg and ask him for brushes and color because he needed artist material. Strindberg never declines from the role of being a poet, or being one who so to say, is mythologizing his own work and his own life. The thing with the palette knife, he had learned already in the 70s when he was as a writer, as an art critic in Paris. He had learned that Gustave Courbet, the great precursor of much modern art, he used the palette knife a lot. Not that he ever abandoned the brushes, but he achieved special effects by using the color as a kind of mason work almost. And Strindberg had learned from that, and he used it a lot, but he could never have painted the lonesome flowers on the beach, for example, with a palette knife. For that you certainly need the brush. This painting is called The Night of Jealousy. And it is a most peculiar, I would say, wedding gift, because it has a dedication on the backside to his second wife, Frida Uhl. He gave this Night of Jealousy to her as his wedding gift. And this certainly is a painting where the palette knife has been working a lot. When he, after the separation from Frida Uhl and after their wedding trip to London, when he was called back to Dornach in Austria, to her relatives to take care of their daughter, the young Justine, something had happened to Strindberg's painting. It's more atmospheric, it's softer, and that can partly be attributed to the fact that he was now painting on the shores of the Donau with a very watery climate and a kind of humid air that gave a different touch to the landscape. It might also have to do with the fact that he had been to London and that he might have seen the paintings by Turner. And he said a few years later in an interview in an English newspaper that Turner was the greatest painter. He was a painter that had meant a lot to him. Where he did see Turner and how he did it is not completely clear, because Turner's estate was, by the time he was there in 1893, it was given to the British state, but it was not exhibited. The Tate Gallery had not opened yet. But in the estate of Strindberg, there are a few reproductions of Turner paintings which are now in the August Strindberg room at the Royal Library here in Stockholm. This is another of these Dono paintings that differ a lot from the previous paintings. This is one version of a big wave that there are several paintings of. There is a whole series, and they are from the late 1890s. He had found a formula where this dramatic heaven with the sun behind the clouds illuminates the top of the wave of a rough sea that is underneath. And he apparently liked that motif very much. Here he has even painted it on the backside. Sometimes he was short on material, and then he used both sides of the canvas. This is again the same. And here he returns after a couple of years to the White Mare, now looking slightly different, but in principle it is a repetition of the previous painting, and there are a few more of that motif. Another example of how he comes to like, and it also simplifies his work on the painting, that he has the image solution clear for himself. The lighthouses, there are two of this kind, and it's a variation of the idea of a lonely figure on the beach facing a kind of cosmic view with a distant horizon. And there are two of this motif. And now we are in the beginning of the 20th century, towards the end of his production of paintings. Here the grotto motif comes again. This is called the Yellow Autumn picture. And it probably has to do with a visit he and his third wife, Harriet Bosse, and their daughter paid to the north of Jutland in Denmark. And it's also a happier, a softer motif than most of the Stockholm Archipelago paintings. And he said on two occasions, both when the little Kerstin, his child with Frida Ol, was born, and Anne-Marie, the child of Harriet Bosse, that he wanted to do something beautiful to greet the newborn baby to this world with. This painting is called Inferno, but it has nothing to do with the book Inferno from the mid-90s. It is painted in the beginning of the 20th century, and it has more to do with the occult diary and with his divorce from Harriet Bosse. But it's very similar to the Wunderland, the painting he just himself described from the essay, even if it is darker and more dramatic. This is quite a large painting of a sunset in the archipelago, which has something of the calmness, of the resignation of the old man who has gone through all his storms and can be absorbed in this very beautifully painted sunset. All the drama has gone, and it's just a late hour on the earth. This is a remarkable painting from these early years in the 20th century. It's called The City, and we see a city lit by a hidden sun far away at the horizon. And the foreground is general drama between a heaven that loads up for a thunderstorm and a black sea that waits to be moved by the strong winds. But this is the moment before the drama. It's a very quiet, very silent thing. And I have sometimes been tempted to interpret this painting as an homage to his native town, to Stockholm, which he had been in so much quarrel with, but never completely could stay away for. It, however, doesn't look much like Stockholm. It looks more like Venice in the way it is, it's flat on the horizon. Venice, though, he didn't like at all. In the 80s, he made a short, very American-like tourist trip to Rome and Venice and some other Italian cities. And what he writes there is not very flattering for the Italian and the Italian culture. He deems it out completely. But if this painting is some kind of juxtaposition between, after all, an impression of beauty in Venice and Stockholm on its seafront, that's an open question. It's quite a large painting to be a Strindberg painting. It's almost 150 high. As I said, Strindberg was also very interested in photography, and he wanted some of his texts to be illustrated by photography. Many of those plans did not work out. He was going to make a trip in central France and describe the life of the French peasantry. And he had a friend with him to take photographs, and nothing came out of it. And there was a big quarrel between them, and we don't know why all the plates were blank when they developed them. A few years later, he had got another camera, and he stayed with his family in Switzerland. And he made an album of his family life in Gersau, the place where he stayed. And he did put together an album that he sent to his publisher in Stockholm, Bonnier, and said he wanted him to publish it as a Christmas book, as a gift from the publisher to his clients. This never came about. It was very expensive to print photographs in those days. And so it didn't come out until the late 1990s. Then the book was finally published. But it did exist in its original edition, like this one. Strindberg had seen, there was a famous chemistry researcher called Chevreuil, who, when he had his 100th birthday, there was an interview made with him by Nadar, the photographer. And it was published with lots of images on Chevreuil, and there was also the questions and the answers underneath. And Strindberg was very impressed by this way of using photography. something very different from the quite academic stage settings that you had in the photo studios in those days. And he wanted to make something similar, and he did it this way. And he had, he could activate the camera himself. Or sometimes seriophonescence seems to have been behind the camera. But here we can see the sun in the library, and Strindberg in full temperament. "Come on, you devils, let's fight," has he written underneath. Here is a snob. And here he says he's a terrible one. And this is a photo that has been given many different interpretations, but the true story seems to have been that Siri von Essen said that he liked very much Strindberg's hair. So he laid his head down on the pulpit, and she could photograph his head from this angle. And here is Siri von Essen. When he wrote to Bonnier, he maintained that Siri was the one who had taken all the photographs, which is certainly not true. But there was an economic reason for that. He owed Bonniers a lot of money. He had got payments in advance and he had not delivered. But they didn't, Siri didn't own anything. So if they took on the publication of this photographic book, they would have to pay Siri for it. So it was a smart idea behind that. He also used photography for some of his sometimes very curious scientific experiments. He had this peculiar idea that on the same hour every day, the same cloud appeared over the same spot in Stockholm. That was the crossing between Linnégatan and Narvavägen, where his friend, the sculptor Carl Eld, had his studio. And he installed a camera in the studio of Carl Eld, and they took these pictures every day around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and Strindberg was convinced that he had proven that clouds are not so hazardous as the meteorologists say. They come the same way and with the same contours. And he also made drawings of this to prove that they appeared that way. In the photographic experiments, there were also lots of portraits taken. He collaborated with a trained photographer, and they did build their own cameras. And among the cameras they used, there was one, a real camera obscura, so the little darkroom camera that had been used since the 17th century in Europe, in many occasions by artists. And there was just one lens, a small hole, and one lens, and then there was a plate on the back side of the box. But Strindberg was not satisfied with having a lens there, because he said the lens distorts reality. So he took out the lens and took the photos just with the lensless camera obscura. And this is one of the self-portraits he took that way. And here this vain man who liked to pose in front of the camera says something very peculiar. He says, "I'm not taking these photographs to make posterity see what I looked like when I was alive. I take them because you will be able to see my character, my inner life, my soul will come out in these photographs. That was the reason for him to take these self-portraits. He also portrayed a lot of his friends among the artists of his own generation, the so-called opponents. Anders Zorn, Carl Larsson, Richard Berg, mainly Richard Berg and Carl Nordström was the two of the group of the opponents who was his lifelong friends. Carl Larsson was it for a long time, but they had a serious clash towards the end of the life of the two of them. Here is one of the last, probably the last image of Strindberg walking in a snowstorm on Drottninggatan outside the Blue Tower, which is now the Strindberg Museum. And there we are back where we began. Well, as I said, there are 110 paintings, all only remaining, and that's most likely most of what he did. A few have disappeared through the years. And they were shown in such a way that, and taken away from the public life in such a way that they could not have had very much of an impact on the art life of Sweden or of Europe around the turn of the century. But what was important to Strindberg was that he was seen by some of his contemporaries, by some of those artists that he highly admired and estimated. And when the opponents who had broken out of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in 1885 had their 10th anniversary on 1895, they made an exhibition, and they invited their friend Strindberg to exhibit with them. He was not in the catalogue, of course, because he was not a member of the group, but he was exhibiting with them. And that must have been a great triumph for him, a moment of great pride to be accepted, to be seen by his contemporaries. His renown as a painter was to be established much later in the 20th century. And I see we have here among us Göran Söderström, who was instrumental in putting the public light on Strindberg as a painter with his thesis and the exhibition at Gallery Observatorium in 1960, and there it started. Then the exhibitions has been going on all over Europe and in pieces also in the US after that. So it's really the last 50 years that are the period for Strindberg's paintings to become public and to be discussed and to be appreciated. Thank you very much.